between that sort of dark and quiet and absolute dark and quiet. And there is a difference between the effect that that sort of nighttime dark and quiet has on you and the effect that absolute and total darkness and silence can have on you. You know, total darkness, pitch blackness, where if you hold your hand up inches from your face, you can't make it out. Total silence, just all-encompassing, where the only sound is your breathing. People who have experienced that sort of darkness and that sort of silence, they describe it not just as an eerie feeling, they describe it as a totally isolating experience. And this isolation can have devastating effects. In 2008, a group of British scientists put some volunteers into a total isolation chamber for 48 hours. They wanted to monitor the effects that this would have on their minds and their physical health. And over the 48 hours, the participants reported losing complete track of time. Complete track of time. You know how difficult it is to lose complete track of time? These participants began to experience paranoia. They had hallucinations. One of them wrote, "By the end, I realized that the lack of stimulation was driving me close to insanity. I felt nothing but numbness, as though I was losing the will to live." Losing the will to live after 48 hours. Now, the likelihood of any of us experiencing that sort of literal darkness and silence is very low, unless we put our hands up for a similar sort of experiment. But there is an experience of darkness, a darkness so complete and so oppressive that is every bit as isolating, that can also make a person lose the will to live. It is the darkness of deep mental and emotional and spiritual anguish. It is the darkness of Job chapter 3. When we encounter Job here, he is a man in deep darkness of grief and pain. That would have come out as Abby read those words aloud. And for him, it's not just dark. This isn't just bedroom dark, nighttime dark. This is pitch blackness. Job chapter 3 is arguably the darkest chapter in the whole book. Job is in his very own spiritual and emotional isolation chamber. And his words here, they are deeply unsettling. They are to me. They're unsettling on a human level because Job appears to be a man who has lost the will to live. And they're unsettling on a spiritual level. How do Job's words here square with the words of the man in chapter 1 and 2? The great man of faith, who even in the face of unimaginable pain and loss says, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." If that's the godly response, blessed be the name of the Lord, what's this? What are these words? This is lament. That's what this is. What's lament? Lament is a forceful expression of grief or sorrow. And Job chapter 3 forces us to wrestle with lament, with the reality of lament, with the experience of lament, and with the place of lament. And especially in the life of faith. As Christian believers, we can find ourselves asking, is lament appropriate? I mean, is this expression of sorrow the spiritual equivalent of losing the will to live? Of succumbing to the darkness? Of giving up on the God of life? In a faith otherwise characterized by hope and peace and joy, does lament express faithlessness because of the lack of hope and the lack of peace and the lack of joy? Maybe you have come here tonight with a smile on your face. Or maybe you have come here with heaviness in your heart. And these are questions that you have about your faith and about your circumstances and what it means to respond to them. Job chapter 3 does help us. So let's have a closer look at it. As we look closer at it, we actually see that there's a bit of a change here. There's a change in style, in what's written here. The text changes from what we call prose, so it's a narrative in chapters 1 and 2, to poetry. And this is very important to realize, because for most of the rest of Job, what we have are speeches by people. And it is very important to recognize that these speeches are not transcripts. They are not transcripts of a conversation. This is not like the court reporter who types everything down and you read it back, exactly what was said. This isn't the parliamentary Hansard, word for word what was said. People don't talk like this. This is poetry. One writer says, people in ancient times did not speak in poetic form to one another any more than we do today. We simply don't talk like this. So this is poetry. It's been expressed this way to make a point. So there's this change in style, but there's also a bit of a change in substance. So chapters 1 and 2 describe events that happened to people, happened to Job. From chapter 3 onwards, we have people expressing their thoughts, expressing their feelings. And it begins here with Job's thoughts. And they are bitter thoughts. After a week of sitting silently in the ashes with his friends, we read in chapter 3, verse 1, after this, Job began to speak and cursed. If you remember back in chapters 1 and 2, Satan said that if God allowed Job to suffer, Job would curse him to his face. And here we get to chapter 3 and Job curses. But he doesn't curse God himself, as Satan predicted. He curses the day that he was born. So verse 3, may the day I was born perish, and the night when they said, a boy is conceived, if only that day had turned to darkness. And he goes on in this way for the next few verses. You can see it there, wishing darkness on his birthday in various ways. And as he does this, it calls to mind another poetic account, the creation account in chapter 1 of Genesis. So Genesis 1:3, when darkness hovered over the surface of the deep. Job wants an uncreation. In effect, he's saying, I wish I had never been created. I wish I'd never been born. It's a troubling thought. It's a troubling thought humanly speaking. And it's a troubling thought spiritually speaking. You know, Job treads a fine line here. By cursing the day of his birth, he comes very close to cursing the one responsible for the day of his birth. And yet, he doesn't quite do that. He doesn't curse God himself. Remember, this is poetry. The language is heightened and extreme. Imagery is brought in. There's a reference there to the Leviathan, the metaphorical creature of the deep, representing chaos and all those sorts of things. And Job knows, he must know that this curse is impossible. He can't actually go back and change the day of his birth. So why is he talking this way? He's talking this way to let us know how he's really feeling. This is a powerful indicator of very real pain, of genuine despair. And his way of thinking is birth only makes sense when life is worth living, if the life that follows it is worth living. If life becomes unbearable, then everything, including the birth itself, was pointless. And that is a terrible thought. Of course, you can see the logic of it. And it's not just the logic of an ancient mind. Just in our modern world, there's this developing movement towards what has been dubbed as antinatalism. Antinatalists believe that procreation always has been and always will be wrong because of life's inevitable suffering. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. Is that all Job is? Is he just an ancient philosopher speculating about these things? He's a pioneering antinatalist? He isn't. Like so many modern philosophies, antinatalism, it's mostly preached by people whose lives, humanly speaking, are quite fine. It's an academic idea. But what did Mike remind us of last week? The suffering that produces Job's questions. Job's questions about suffering don't take place in the university hall. They take place in the hospital ward. Job is speaking this way because of his own deeply painful experience of loss, his very real feelings of grief. So if he's going to think about his birth this way, what does that say about his faith? Is this faithless thinking to speak this way about his life, the life that God has given him? I don't think it is. It's worth noting that Job isn't the only Old Testament figure to use this sort of language to express these sorts of thoughts. The writer of Ecclesiastes, who also reflects on this world and suffering and pain, he writes this. He says, I admire the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive, but better than either of them is the one who has not yet existed, who has not yet seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. Never had to experience the awful things that this world has to throw at us. So Job's words, they are bitter. And they are unrealistic, but they are not fundamentally faithless. They are a powerful way of expressing very real hurt. And they're not in isolation, because Job goes on. As we see in the next bit, the thing that Job desires more than anything else is rest. So you see this especially in verses 13 and 17 and 26, these references to rest. And at this point, in Job's view, the only thing that would provide rest is death. And so he returns to the idea of being born, but he wishes this time, still horribly, that he'd been stillborn. And he died as he came from the womb. Why? Well, if that had happened, then verse 13, now I would certainly be lying in peace. I would be asleep. Then I would be at rest. Another shocking thought. But again, this is a thought at the heart of Shakespeare's most famous soliloquy. So the play Hamlet, his famous speech there, to be or not to be. That means to live or not to live. If you're all familiar with it, Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, he's learnt that his father was murdered by his uncle. And as he considers this and the awfulness of it and trying to seek justice from it, and he considers all of life's hardships, he wonders whether he should even attempt to push back on this or just give up, just end his troubles by dying. That is Job here in the middle part of chapter 3. Wanting to end life's troubles by resting in death, wanting not to be. And this rest Job imagines sharing with everyone, with the world's most powerful and celebrated, so the kings and the counselors of the earth, the princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver, they'll be there. And he'll also share this rest with the despised and the downtrodden, the wicked who no longer make trouble, the weary, those who had lost their freedom in this world. In Job's view of things, all of them alike, the small, the great, they will find rest in death. That's his hope as he expresses it in this middle bit. And again, this is not a hope that's just restricted to Job and his ancient world. Our culture continues to hold on to this idea. What is the most stereotypical thing to put on a gravestone? R-I-P. Rest in peace. And we see where that idea comes from. It creates a certain degree of sense. So much of our suffering is tied to how we feel physically and emotionally, how we think. And so when physical sensation ceases and mental turmoil ceases, then the suffering stops. Then we find rest, right? You can see the attraction of that idea. Of course, for us, who in the rest of the Bible have God's fuller revelation, we know that what ultimately awaits each of us is an eternity either with God and in his present goodness or without him. And without his goodness is anything but rest. Job's understanding is Sheol, the place of the dead. And to an extent, there's a neutral sense that everyone goes there. And that's what Job is kind of hinting at here. Or maybe we'll all just go there and rest. Although even as he speaks of it here, in his clearer moments, he knows that Sheol isn't simply a place of neutral rest. It's a horrible place. If you look ahead to chapter 17, he speaks of it there as a place of decay. But in his desperation right now, in this moment, in chapter 3, he can only imagine it as release from what he's going through. And that is deeply troubling, that he would think that. You know, if you Google, "I wish I were dead," the top search result is the phone number for Lifeline, the Crisis Support and Suicide Prevention Service. That is a very good thing that is the top search result. It's wonderful that the search engine functions that way, that sort of idea that someone would type that into Google will be directed to help in that way. But it's also a horrible thing that it has to function that way, that someone would do that someone would be brought to that place. Job is in that place. He desires rest. And from the moment he sees that that's going to happen in death. And maybe you know what Job is expressing here. Maybe in some way, shape or form. Or certainly you've known of someone, a family member, a friend. Well, it doesn't stop there. Because Job goes on even more. His desire for rest in death actually isn't absolute because of his restlessness. He's questioning restlessness, and that is how he ends his speech. This final bit of his speech, Job speaks on behalf of all who suffer. So if you look at verse 20, he says, "Why is light given to one burdened with grief, and life to those whose existence is bitter, who wait for death but it doesn't come, and search for it more than hidden treasure, who are filled with much joy and are glad when they reach the grave?" Why? Why is life given to those who suffer? I mean, this is the deep reason for Job's restlessness. His unrest is because he can't understand his sufferings. He can't understand why a believer, a man of godliness, would suffer with this sort of intensity. Because in his moral framework and his understanding of the universe that God has set up and that God is over, well, then the righteous, they receive God's blessing, and the wicked, who don't want anything to do with God, they suffer. But his experience has turned all of that around. His whole moral framework has been shaken up. And he won't rest until he has some sort of resolution to this question. Why? And that questioning shows that Job still holds God responsible. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. He still holds God responsible. After all, he speaks of light and life being given. By whom is it given? It's given by God. The same God who gives the hedge. You see that? God who hedges in a person and hides their path from them. If you were here last week at the beginning, you'll recall that Satan accused God of putting a hedge around Job. It was a helpful hedge, a hedge that protected him from life's harsh realities. Here, Job speaks of a hedge from God as well. It's a harmful hedge. It's a hedge of imprisonment. As one writer describes, a life locked into trouble with the key thrown away. Job here reminds me a bit of the character Paul Sheldon from Stephen King's story Misery. In the story, he's an author. He's in a car crash in the snow and he's saved by this avid fan, Annie. And he finds himself in her house, initially being cared for, away from the harms of the outside that he's experienced. But over time, he realized he's actually imprisoned here. Annie has hedged him in. And what he thought was certain freedom, it turns out to be endless confinement and misery. And he can't understand it. Why keep me alive if you're just going to make my life miserable? That's how Job feels here at the end of his speech. That's his agonized question. His question is, why life at all if it's all just pain? Why life at all? I'm just a target here for suffering. That's the emphasis at the end of the speech, isn't it? All these things, all these bad things that happen to him, that come upon him. His sighing, his groaning, his dread, his trouble. And as all these things have come upon him, Job has found that his worst nightmare has come true. The thing I feared has overtaken me. What I dreaded has happened to me. What is that? It seems that what Job always feared was losing God's favor. He feared it so much he took all sorts of precautions against it. Again, if you remember back to chapter 1, what did he do for his kids? He offered sacrifices on their behalf just in case, in their hearts, they had sinned against God. And yet, It's apparently happened anyway. He's lost God's favor. Why? No wonder he asked why. And this why, the whys that he asked right at the end of this speech, they set in motion all the questioning that Job does in the next 30-odd chapters. Why, God? Why? So I don't have to tell you that Job 3 is a hard read. You know that. It is one long lament from everything, from birth, from pre-birth, to birth, to life, to death. But hard as it is to read, Job 3 does teach us that being in the isolation chamber of grief and sorrow does not mean being isolated from God, despite how much it might feel like it. Job is restless because he knows that God is there. This is the faith and the hope of Job. See, a restless man isn't a defeated man. A troubled person questioning their circumstances is not a hopeless person resigned to their fate. There is something vital there. Job has faith that the God who made him and whom he has worshipped faithfully is in control. And this is acknowledged. This faith of Job is acknowledged by none other than God himself. We have to fast forward to the end of the book of Job. But right at the end, in chapter 42, God refers to what Job has said. And he declares that Job has spoken the truth about me. He has spoken the truth about me. And when God says that, he isn't just referring to what Job has said in the immediate verses. He's talking about everything that Job has said, including here in chapter 3. What Job says here is right in God's eyes. And maybe you need to hear that tonight. Because while Job chapter 3 is one long lament, it reminds us that not only are there times when there simply is no other response possible for us, when things are that dark, but to respond this way is to acknowledge that this is not how things should be. And it's to acknowledge it before the one who can change those things. So take heart. Lament is right and it is proper. God is big enough to take it. To lament like Job is to recognize that he is ultimately in control. It's actually a response of deep faith because it acknowledges that God alone is the one who can change the situation and bring deliverance. That is the faith and hope of Job. And that is the faith and hope of the gospel. Because the ultimate change in situation, our ultimate deliverance is ultimately found in Jesus. Jesus, who was himself a man of sorrow, even more profoundly than Job was. That's how the prophet Isaiah describes him. And when you read the account of Jesus on the cross, you know he who knew no sin became sin for us. Jesus on the cross lamented to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Not only does God know at the deepest level what our suffering is like, in Jesus he has taken away its ultimate sting, the ultimate sting of grief and sorrow. Jesus' death on our behalf and resurrection means that the rest that eluded Job, that is possible for each of us. It really is. Because of the man of sorrows, we can be people of sorrow, for whom sorrow is not the end. Because of the man of sorrows, we can be people of sorrow, for whom sorrow is not the end. Now, does this mean that just by knowing this and believing this, we will instantly feel happy in the present? No. That our afflictions will necessarily disappear in the time frame that we really want? Not necessarily. Because there is a time for mourning and weeping. Job 3 tells us that at the very least. And so how do we live with that? How do we help others live with that? Well, one way we do that is we weep with those who weep. That's what the Apostle Paul calls us to do. to weep with those who weep. Jesus himself calls us to this, to comfort those who mourn. So we need to make sure that we are a church community where people feel like they can lament depending on what is going on for them. And that people will come around them and weep with them as they do so. Not to deny those feelings and suppress them, but to acknowledge them and express them. And so that might mean simply sitting with someone as they weep and weeping alongside them, which is what happened this morning, it must be said, for a few people. And hopefully it will mean praying with them to the God who is in control and who loves them. And I know I always find opportunities to plug discipleship groups, but let me plug discipleship groups to you right now, because it's in smaller groups where you can get to know one another more intimately, develop trust, where you can know what is going on for people when they are really hurting and in a dark place, and you can come beside them in this way. It really helps that. And as you do that, hopefully you will be able to lift one another's eyes to the cross and to the empty tomb and remind them of the hope we have. Because the hope we have changes the way that we weep with those who weep. Because we don't grieve as those without hope. Doesn't mean our grief is any less painful, but it will be more hopeful. Even more hopeful than Job's was. Because we grieve in light of a future where grief, crying, and pain will exist no longer. Let me pray. Father God, help us to express what we're really feeling. Thank you for the testimony and experience of Job. Help us to not suppress the hard things that we are feeling, but to know that you are big enough and loving enough to hear them. And I pray that you would give us the courage and the boldness and the compassion to be there for one another. Maybe this very evening. And we pray this in Jesus' risen name. Amen.